Mark Reynolds stood in front of the bathroom mirror, the steam from his morning shower still clinging to the glass. The sun hadn't even risen yet, but Mark was already halfway through his strict grooming ritual. Hair combed, face shaved smooth, tie laid out, shirt pressed, everything in its place. Except one thing. His eyes locked onto it immediately. There it was, a single dark hair, thick and coarse, curling slightly just inside his left nostril. It wasn't hanging out, not exactly, but it was visible, especially under the bright vanity lights. Mark leaned closer, narrowing his eyes. No, this wasn't acceptable. Not today. Not ever. He exhaled sharply, pulled open the drawer to his left, and reached for the small stainless steel tweezers he always kept on hand. The same pair he had owned since college. The same pair he had used every week, sometimes every day. He brought them up to his face, turned his head slightly, and tilted it back. The hair was deeper than usual. Not right at the edge, but further in. He opened the tweezers, angled them carefully into the nostril, and pinched the base of the hair. It resisted slightly, like it didn't want to let go. Mark pulled. A sharp sting bloomed through his nose like a needle had been jammed into the inside of his skull. His eyes watered instantly, and a strange pressure throbbed up behind his eyes. He let out a quick breath through clenched teeth and pulled the tweezers back to inspect his prize. The hair was there, root and all, but it was shiny, slick with something clear. Blood followed, just a tiny bead, which dripped to the edge of his nostril and paused there. Mark dabbed it with toilet paper, watching as a red dot slowly bloomed into the white. For a moment he hesitated. That felt different. He pressed the paper again, harder this time, then glanced back up into the mirror. The bleeding had stopped. He tilted his head, inspecting his work. Smooth, clean, professional, just the way he needed to look. He tossed the tissue in the trash, rinsed the tweezers under hot water, and went back to buttoning his shirt, the brief discomfort already fading from his mind. He had no idea that those 30 seconds in front of the mirror were about to change his entire life. Years later, Mark would remember that moment with razor clarity, the angle of the light, the cool feel of the tweezers, the single bead of blood. He would remember it like a crime scene. A crime he didn't know he had committed, not until it was far too late. But on that morning, Mark Reynolds was just a man trying to look presentable, trying not to become that kid again. It always started with the mirror. When Mark was 14, his body betrayed him, the kind of betrayal all teenage boys know. Greasy skin, voice cracks, awkward limbs. But for Mark, it was his nose. His father had always joked that Mark had inherited the Reynolds Bridge, a strong, prominent nose, Roman and proud. But kids don't respect heritage. They called him names. Stupid, petty things. Mouths full of braces and cruelty. One day in gym class, while changing in the locker room, a kid named Bradley pointed and said, "Dude, it looks like you've got a squirrel trying to escape your face." Laughter erupted. Mark flushed deep red. He didn't understand at first, until Bradley elaborated. "Your nose, man. You got like jungle vines coming out of it. That's disgusting." From then on, he was Moss Nose, or sometimes Mark the Monkey. It wasn't just teasing. It was annihilation. Every time he laughed too hard, and his nostrils flared, he became a target. He started covering his face when he laughed. Then he stopped laughing altogether. One night after school, he locked himself in the bathroom with his father's grooming kit. He opened every drawer, searching for something, anything, that could fix the thing that made him disgusting. That was the first time he found the tweezers. He didn't know what he was doing. He just knew it had to go. He leaned into the mirror and began pulling. It hurt. His nose bled. But it felt like victory. Later, when his dad knocked on the door and asked what the hell he was doing, Mark said he was just washing up. His dad grunted approval through the door. "Keep yourself clean, son. A man who can't keep his damn face clean doesn't deserve to be called one." It wasn't a hug. It wasn't "you're okay just the way you are." But it was the closest thing to affection Mark got from him. And so the ritual began. As he got older, Mark learned to manage it better. Better tweezers, better lighting. He became efficient, controlled. He wasn't Moss Nose anymore. Now he was the sharpest looking guy in the office. People trusted clean faces, trusted order. Amanda used to tease him gently when they first moved in together. "Babe," she'd say, standing behind him in the mirror. "No one's looking up your nose, I promise." But he couldn't help it. Not anymore. It wasn't about anyone else. It was about keeping the chaos out. This morning was no different. Just another tiny correction in a world where appearance was everything. He glanced at the clock. 7:22 a.m., right on schedule. Mark gave his collar one last adjustment, smoothed the front of his shirt, and walked out of the bathroom, confident that he had once again defeated the thing inside him that tried to make him small. He had no idea that just beneath the surface of his skin, a war had already begun. Mark sat at the kitchen counter, sipping black coffee from a ceramic mug with a hairline crack down one side. The silence in the apartment was familiar, almost comforting. Just the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the stove. Amanda was still asleep, curled up in their bedroom down the hall, but Mark had been up since before 6. He always was. His morning routine had become less about getting ready and more about staying in control. Every task had its place: teeth, shower, hair, nose. Especially the nose. The tweezers rested on the edge of the sink, still damp from the rinse, and even though the incident with the plucked hair had passed, the tender throb inside his nostril lingered. Nothing alarming, just a reminder. Like a muscle sore from a good workout. Mark wasn't someone who left things to chance. He kept a weekly planner, color-coded. He checked locks 3 times before bed. Every meal was portioned. His sock drawer was organized by color and thickness. Amanda used to find it endearing, even helpful, but lately she had started using words like rigid and inflexible. She'd laughed the first time he brought home a new pair of nose scissors. "You already have a pair," she said, waving them like a tiny toy sword. "Are you building an arsenal?" Mark had smiled tightly. The blades on the old one were dull. These curve better. Less risk of nicking the membrane. Amanda blinked. That's oddly specific. He hadn't told her about the time he'd clipped too close and caused a small bleed that lasted nearly an hour. Or the time, years ago, when a minor infection from plucking had made his nose swell slightly, just enough that he noticed it in photos and couldn't stop staring. It wasn't vanity. It was vigilance. He had always told himself that. In college, he'd dated a girl who once joked that he groomed like a serial killer. That relationship lasted 3 weeks. Amanda was different. She was patient, practical, a schoolteacher who wore her hair in loose buns and left mugs of tea half drunk around the house. She'd grown used to his rituals over the years. Most of them, anyway. Still, she'd raised her eyebrows the day she found his little mirror. It was a pocket mirror, the size of a coaster, with a magnified side that showed every pore in merciless detail. Mark kept it in the medicine cabinet, tucked behind the shaving cream. When she discovered it, she'd laughed. "You have a spyglass for nose hairs?" Mark had shrugged. "It helps." Amanda didn't push, but she didn't forget either. This morning, the soreness inside his nostril had faded slightly, but the skin around it still felt raw. He thought about dabbing a little more ointment on it before leaving for work, just in case. But that would break routine, and that was dangerous. Slippery. He set his coffee down and wiped the corner of his mouth with a napkin. Then, as always, he went back to the bathroom for the final check. Lighting, good. Angle slightly turned, head tilted back. He peered into his left nostril, still a little pink, a small raised area, like the beginning of a pimple, but nothing dramatic. No pus, no swelling, not really. He pressed gently on the outside. A dull ache, but not unbearable. Could be a blocked follicle, he muttered to himself, then immediately regretted giving it a label. Naming things gave them power. Back in high school, after the locker room incident, he'd started collecting vocabulary for every flaw he noticed in himself. Hyperpigmentation, sebaceous filaments, deviated septum, terms that made him feel smarter than the insecurity, but they didn't make it go away. Amanda stirred around 7:40. He heard her footsteps before she appeared in the hallway, wrapped in a gray robe, hair loose around her shoulders. "Hey," she said, voice still thick with sleep. "You already caffeinated?" Mark nodded. "Just finished." She padded to the coffee maker and poured herself half a mug. Added sugar, then cream. Her ritual, less precise, but no less comforting. "You look sharp," she said, turning to him. "Big client today?" "Yeah. 2, actually. Back to back. Hospital administrators." He straightened the cuffs of his dress shirt. "I need to look polished." Amanda leaned against the counter, sipping. "I think they'll be more focused on your pitch than your nostrils." He stiffened slightly, and she caught it. "Sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean that in a bad way." Mark smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I know." She studied him for a moment. "Still sore? A little. You know, I've been meaning to get you one of those little electric trimmers. The kind with the rounded tip, safer than tweezers. I don't like machines near my face. They're designed for it. I prefer control. Amanda didn't argue. She just sipped her coffee and looked at him over the rim of the mug. Sometimes, in moments like this, Mark wondered what it was like to be someone who didn't notice, who could leave the house with uneven eyebrows or a crooked collar and not spiral into distraction. He wondered what it was like to live inside Amanda's head, where a stray hair was just that, stray, not symbolic. But that wasn't his reality. He had learned too early that the world judged you before you spoke. That one visual flaw could erase everything else. He wasn't going back to being Moss Nose, not again. He left for work at exactly 8:15, after checking the stove and windows and front door twice. Amanda kissed his cheek, warm and brief. Text me if you're running late. He nodded. The drive to the office was smooth, just under 20 minutes. Mark kept the radio off. Silence helped him mentally rehearse. He had 2 meetings today, both important. One with a regional health group looking to expand pharmaceutical supply contracts, the other with a smaller clinic evaluating long-term partnerships. His pitch was tight, rehearsed, evidence-based. He had the stats, he had the charm, all he needed was the face. At a red light he checked the mirror again. The swelling inside his left nostril hadn't grown, but it felt more noticeable now, a steady pressure, like a balloon inflating very slowly behind his face. He pushed the thought away, focused on breathing. Deep breath in, through the nose. He winced, exhale. Through the mouth. It was probably just inflammation. Plucking could do that. He knew this, he'd looked it up before. The follicle could get irritated, maybe even mildly infected, but it usually cleared up in a day or 2. Antibiotic ointment, warm compresses, nothing major. He didn't need Amanda's electric trimmer. He didn't need a doctor. He needed the day to go according to plan. At the office, people greeted him like always. Small nods, smiles, a few quick handshakes. Mark responded in kind, but part of his mind stayed inside his nose. He could feel it pulsing faintly with his heartbeat. Still no visible swelling from the outside, but that made it worse somehow, like something lurking, hiding. He ducked into the restroom before the first meeting. Under the fluorescent lights, he leaned toward the mirror, tilted his head again, and looked. The raised spot was still there, maybe a little redder, maybe a little larger. He pressed it gently. The ache had grown sharper, still not enough to panic over, but enough to notice, enough to make him nervous. He washed his hands carefully, dried them with a paper towel, and stood there a moment longer. Then he whispered, almost without meaning to, "Not today, not before the pitch, not before the contract, whatever this was, it could wait." Mark turned, adjusted his tie, and walked out of the restroom, completely unaware that beneath the surface of his skin, something was already beginning to spread. By lunchtime, the discomfort inside Mark's nose had shifted from subtle to persistent. It wasn't pain, not exactly, more like pressure, a dull, steady sensation that made him acutely aware of the left side of his face. Every time he spoke, every time he inhaled through his nose, he felt it, that small, tight throb behind the nostril. He excused himself between meetings and returned to the men's restroom, locking the door behind him. Under the overhead lights, he leaned into the mirror and tilted his head back. There it was. The spot was no longer just red. It had become slightly raised, the skin around it taut and shiny. Not enough to be alarming, but enough to be different. He ran the tip of his finger along the outer curve of his nose, pressing gently. A sharper ache pulsed through his upper lip and cheek. Mark frowned. He pulled a tissue from the dispenser and dabbed at the nostril. No blood, no pus. The tissue came away clean. That had to be a good sign. Maybe it was just irritation from the tweezers. He'd gone a little deeper than usual that morning, trying to grip the root. Maybe he'd scraped the membrane or bruised it. It would pass. These things always passed. He tossed the tissue and washed his hands, but he couldn't shake the unease creeping in. The pressure wasn't supposed to last this long. Usually by now, the sting faded. The skin calmed, but this time it lingered. When he returned to his desk, he avoided touching his face. Though the urge was constant, he was sure he hadn't been careless. The tweezers were clean. He'd rinsed them in hot water. He always did. That was part of the process. Still, what if? No, it was nothing. He pulled up his calendar and reviewed the afternoon schedule. The second meeting was in 30 minutes, an internal pitch to the client onboarding team, followed by a dinner with potential partners. He couldn't afford to be distracted. He opened a new tab and typed into the search bar, "nose sore after plucking hair." Dozens of results appeared, blog posts, Reddit threads, medical forums. Some said it was normal, just inflammation. Some mentioned folliculitis. One post, buried halfway down the page, used the term nasal vestibulitis. He clicked it. The article was from a dermatology site. It described an infection of the hair follicles inside the nostrils, sometimes caused by plucking. Symptoms included redness, swelling, tenderness, and, in rare cases, abscess formation. Mark stopped reading. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. The room felt too quiet, too bright. He reminded himself that it was probably mild. The internet always exaggerated. Every symptom ended in worst-case scenarios. He wasn't going to spiral. He minimized the browser and forced himself back into work mode. The next meeting went smoothly, on paper. Mark delivered the pitch, answered questions, even cracked a joke or two. But halfway through the presentation, he became distracted by the steady pulsing in his face, like a small drum beating behind his nose. He touched it once, absently, then caught himself. Afterward, one of his colleagues leaned in with a concerned look. "You good, Mark? You seemed a little off." Mark forced a smile. "Didn't sleep well. I'm fine." The colleague nodded and moved on, but Mark could feel the doubt lingering behind her eyes. Back at his desk, the sensation in his nose had evolved. Now there was a subtle warmth spreading outward, from the center of the soreness toward his cheek. It wasn't visible, not yet, but he could feel it blooming under the skin like a slow, deep bruise. He stood up, went to the break room, grabbed a bottle of water, and held it to his face for a moment before unscrewing the cap. The cold helped. A little. A voice in his head told him to go home. Another voice told him not to be ridiculous. It was just a plucked hair. That's all. By the time Mark arrived home, the ache inside his nose had transformed into a throb, slow, rhythmic, and impossible to ignore. It pulsed with his heartbeat, dull at first, then sharper if he bent forward or turned his head too fast. His left cheek felt fuller than the right, as if something beneath the surface was quietly expanding, pushing outward. Amanda noticed immediately. "You're pale," she said, frowning as she stepped into the kitchen. "And you're holding your face. What's wrong?" Mark shook his head as he slipped off his shoes. "Nothing serious. I think I just irritated a follicle this morning." She crossed her arms. "The one you plucked?" "Yeah." She walked closer and peered up at him. "Let me see." He sighed but tilted his head back. Amanda turned on her phone's flashlight and gently steadied his chin. He winced when her fingers grazed the side of his nose. "Whoa," she whispered. "It's swollen in there. I know. And red. Like really red. There's a bump, kind of shiny. It looks infected, Mark." He pulled away, lowering his head. "It's just a little folliculitis. I looked it up." Amanda raised her eyebrows. "Great. So you're diagnosing yourself now?" Mark didn't respond. He walked to the sink and filled a glass of water, took a sip, then placed the glass down with more force than necessary. Amanda watched him carefully. "Why don't you go to urgent care?" she asked. "Just to be safe." "Because it's not serious," he snapped, then softened his voice. "It's uncomfortable, but it'll go down in a day or two. I've had this kind of thing before." Amanda's eyes narrowed. "When?" "A few years ago. It went away on its own. You never told me, because it was nothing then, and it's nothing now." Amanda didn't argue further, but the look on her face said everything. She didn't believe him. She was worried, and he hated that, hated being seen as vulnerable, as if his body was failing in some small, stupid way. He excused himself and went into the bathroom again. The lighting was better than at the office, and he could examine the spot more closely. It had grown. What had started that morning as a pinhead-sized irritation was now clearly a bump, round, red, with a faint yellowish center. It glistened under the light, and the skin surrounding it looked stretched, like a blister waiting to pop. He touched the outside of his nose gently. Pain flared, not sharp, not unbearable, but deep, the kind of pain that radiated outward, the kind that said something under the skin was gathering, building, preparing. He washed his hands, took a Q-tip, and lightly pressed around the area, testing for drainage. Nothing emerged. He applied a thin layer of over-the-counter antibiotic ointment inside the nostril, as carefully as he could. Then he stared at his reflection. His face looked the same, mostly, but the left side of his nose now had a slight asymmetry, subtle, probably only noticeable to someone who knew his face well, someone like Amanda. He backed away from the mirror and turned off the light. That night in bed, he couldn't fall asleep. He lay on his back, then on his right side, avoiding pressure on the left. But the throb was constant, like a warning bell muffled in cotton. Amanda, already drifting off, stirred beside him. "You okay?" she mumbled. "Yeah," he whispered. "Just can't get comfortable." She reached out and touched his arm. Her fingers were warm, familiar. "Try not to mess with it, okay?" "I won't." But he did. After she fell asleep, Mark found his hand drifting up, fingers brushing the side of his nose again and again, checking, measuring, pressing. It was still there, still growing. He closed his eyes and told himself that in the morning, it would be better. Things always looked worse at night. Tomorrow, it would calm down. Go back to normal. It had to. The pain woke him before the alarm did. Mark sat up in bed, clutching the left side of his face, as a sharp throbbing ache pierced through the layers of sleep. It felt like someone had stuffed cotton soaked in acid into his nostril. The sensation was no longer localized, it had spread. He stumbled into the bathroom, flicked on the light, and froze at the mirror. His reflection didn't look like him. The left side of his nose was visibly swollen, inflamed, puffy. The skin along his nostril looked stretched and glossy, like it might split. The swelling extended outward, distorting the contour of his cheek, pushing upward toward his lower eyelid. He tilted his head back. The bump inside his nostril had grown overnight. It was now the size of a marble, angry, red, and firm, with a yellow-white center. The tissues inside were so engorged that the airway on that side was nearly closed. He tried to breathe through it. Nothing came through. It was completely blocked. His stomach sank. He reached up and pressed the outside of his nostril gently. Mistake. The pain was instant, radiating through his entire face. Tears sprung to his eyes involuntarily. The heat of the swelling made the skin warm to the touch, almost hot. He backed away from the mirror. "Mark?" Amanda's voice called sleepily from the bedroom. "Everything okay?" He didn't answer right away. When he returned to the bedroom, Amanda sat up in bed, blinking at the harsh morning light. "Oh my God," she said, her voice sharp. "Your face. I know. Mark, it's swollen. Like you've been stung by something. I think the infection spread. No, this isn't just an irritation anymore. You need to see a doctor. Today." Mark hesitated. "I have a quarterly meeting with the regional VP this afternoon." Amanda stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You're seriously thinking about work right now? It's important. You look like you're in a car crash victims before photo. I can power through." "Power through." "Mark, you can barely breathe through your nose. That's not normal swelling. That's not something you tough out." He avoided her gaze and walked to the closet, started getting dressed slowly. Every movement, every tug of fabric made the throbbing worse. He swallowed down 2 ibuprofen and a strong coffee like it might somehow beat back the infection crawling across his face. By the time he reached the office, it was clear no one would be able to ignore what was happening to him. People stared. His assistant looked up and actually recoiled. "Oh my God, are you okay?" she whispered. Mark mumbled something about a sinus infection and ducked into his office, closing the door. He opened his laptop but couldn't focus. The pressure inside his face was now unbearable. His left nostril felt like it had doubled in size. The skin around his cheekbone was tight, and it was getting harder to open his mouth fully without pain. He opened his front-facing camera. It was worse than the bathroom mirror had shown. The entire left side of his face was now visibly distorted. The redness had deepened to a blotchy pink. The swelling had migrated into his cheek and lower eyelid. His eye itself was starting to look slightly closed from the tissue pressure. He looked wrong, mutated, like someone else. His phone buzzed. A text from Amanda. "Please, go to urgent care. I'm serious, you don't look okay." "I'm worried." Mark stared at the message, thumb hovering over the screen. He didn't want to be the guy who missed a meeting over a swollen face. He didn't want to be the weak link. He didn't want to admit, especially not to himself, that something as stupid as a nose hair could unravel everything. He put the phone down, and that's when it happened. A sharp, searing pain shot through his upper lip and cheek, stronger than anything he'd felt so far. It felt like something inside had torn, like a membrane giving way. He gasped aloud, grabbing his face as the pain radiated upward into his eye socket. His vision blurred. His hands trembled. He couldn't sit still. He pushed away from the desk and stood up, the room spinning slightly. Every heartbeat seemed to slam into his nose from the inside out. This was no longer manageable. This was something else. Mark didn't remember the elevator ride down to the parking garage. He didn't remember driving out of the lot or what music had been playing on the radio. All he could recall was the mounting sense of pressure, physical, emotional, all of it building like a balloon inflating behind his face, tighter with every passing second, By the time he pulled into the urgent care parking lot, the pain was so intense it made his left eye water uncontrollably. He clutched the steering wheel for a moment, forehead pressed against it, trying to summon the strength to stand. Inside the clinic, the receptionist didn't ask many questions. One look at Mark's face, red, grotesquely swollen, with the skin around his left cheek now a purplish hue, was enough. They took him back almost immediately. A nurse practitioner entered the room, her expression changing the moment she saw him. She didn't bother hiding it. "How long has this been going on?" Mark could barely speak. "Since yesterday morning. You plucked a hair, right?" He nodded slowly. Her eyes narrowed as she moved closer to examine his face. "We see folliculitis sometimes, even abscesses. But this is moving fast. You've got cellulitis, possibly an abscess, maybe worse." She stepped out of the room and returned with a physician a few minutes later. The doctor, a compact man in his late 40s with a calm demeanor, assessed Mark quickly. He used a penlight to look inside the nostril but didn't touch anything. "You're going to the ER," the doctor said bluntly. "This isn't something we can manage here. The infection is spreading into your face, and given the location," Mark already knew what he was going to say. "The danger triangle," he whispered hoarsely. The doctor looked surprised. "You're familiar?" "I read about it." "Well, then you know how serious this is. The veins in your face, particularly around your nose and upper lip, connect directly to your brain through the cavernous sinus. Infections in this area can lead to cavernous sinus thrombosis. You don't want to mess around with this." Mark's throat went dry. "We'll arrange transport. Ambulance to the hospital with a CT scan ready when you arrive. They'll start 4 antibiotics immediately. Hopefully we're catching it in time." Amanda arrived at the hospital just after Mark had been taken for imaging. When she saw him being wheeled back down the hall, a nurse guiding the stretcher, she stopped dead in her tracks. "Oh my God," she gasped. The swelling was worse now. The entire left side of Mark's face was distorted, his eye nearly swollen shut. A thin line of reddish fluid had begun to leak from inside his nostril, soaking the gauze they'd taped in place. Mark saw the horror in her eyes and turned away. She caught up to the stretcher, grabbed his hand. "I'm here," she said softly. He couldn't speak. His throat was thick with shame and fear. All the bravado from earlier had been stripped away. The ER doctor, a woman in her 50s named Dr. Elena Ruiz, came in moments later. She pulled up the CT scan on the monitor and began explaining the situation. "There's a large abscess in your nasal vestibule," she said. "It's filled with fluid, most likely pus. The infection is spreading into your cheek and possibly toward the maxillary sinus." Mark swallowed hard. Dr. Ruiz's expression was calm, but serious. "The real concern is that the infection could reach the cavernous sinus. That's the part of the brain where several cranial nerves and veins converge. If it does, we're looking at a life-threatening complication." Amanda's hand tightened around Mark's. "You're lucky you came in when you did," Dr. Ruiz continued. "Another day, and this could have been catastrophic." "What's the next step?" Amanda asked. 4 antibiotics, immediately. Broad spectrum. We'll consult ENT surgery. He'll most likely need the abscess drained." Mark flinched. "Surgery?" "Yes. We don't want to wait for it to rupture or spread. Surgical drainage will relieve the pressure and let us clean out the infection." They started the 4 in his right arm, fluids and antibiotics rushing into his veins. The pain in his face was unbearable now. Every breath through his mouth felt like swallowing glass. His lips were dry. His nose throbbed with every beat of his heart. Amanda stayed by his side as they prepped him for surgery. Mark stared at the ceiling, unable to stop the flood of thoughts crashing through his head. It was all so absurd, so ridiculous. A nose hair. That's how it started. But in the silence of the pre-op room, the old voices from his childhood came creeping back. "You're soft. Stop being so sensitive. Real men don't complain. Get over it." He'd internalized those rules so deeply that even now, facing the very real possibility that the infection in his face could kill him, he felt guilty, like he'd failed by not being tougher, by not brushing it off. Amanda leaned down, brushing hair from his forehead. "We're going to get through this," she said. "Okay? You're going to be fine." Mark wanted to believe her, but all he could feel was fear and a deep, gnawing regret for not listening sooner. The operating room was colder than Mark expected. Everything looked white. The walls, the ceiling tiles, the gowns, the surgical tools lined up on stainless steel trays. A nurse adjusted the 4 bag while another checked the monitors, their movements brisk but methodical. Mark lay on the table staring up at the circular surgical lights above, their glow diffused by a clear plastic cover. The pain in his face had dulled to a heavy, pulsing ache, tempered only by the initial dose of painkillers. He could barely feel his left cheek anymore, not because it didn't hurt, but because the nerves were so inflamed it all blended into a haze of pressure and heat. Dr. Kevin Lang, the ENT surgeon, entered the room. Late 40s, tall, composed and direct. He greeted Mark with a calm nod, pulling on his gloves. "I've reviewed your scans. The abscess is sizable, over 3 centimeters in diameter and pressing against your sinus wall," Dr. Lang explained. "The inflammation is extensive, but I believe we can drain it successfully without external incisions. Everything will be done internally, through the nasal vestibule." Mark tried to speak but only managed to whisper. "Will I look different?" Dr. Lang paused, his eyes softening. "We won't know for certain until the swelling resolves. The tissue is under a lot of stress right now. Our priority is stopping the infection from spreading." "You're in good hands, Mark." The anesthesiologist leaned over him. "Okay, Mr. Eddington, I'm going to place a mask over your face now. Just breathe normally for me. You'll start feeling sleepy in a few seconds." Mark nodded weakly, barely registering the mask's cool plastic edge as it settled over his mouth and nose. He drew in a breath, then another, then nothing. The next thing he knew, everything was fog, voices muffled, lights blurry, his body heavy, like he was buried under wet blankets. He blinked slowly. There was a ceiling above him again, but it wasn't the OR. He was somewhere else. A beeping monitor to his right, a dull ache that felt like it was carved into his bones. A nurse appeared beside him, smiling gently. "Mr. Eddington, welcome back. You're in recovery. The surgery went well." Mark tried to speak but couldn't. His mouth was too dry, his throat burned. "You've got nasal packing and a drain in place," the nurse continued. "Try not to touch your face. Just rest." He raised a trembling hand, stopping just short of his nose. Something was stuffed inside. Thick gauze packing filled both nostrils, sealed with medical tape. He could feel something tugging from inside his left nostril, a drain tube taped to his cheek, leading to a small suction bulb hanging from the bed rail. Every inch of his face throbbed. Dr. Lang came by later, reviewing the post-op scans on a tablet. He pulled up one of the images and turned it toward Mark. "This dark area was the abscess," he said, pointing. "It was large, almost 4 centimeters, and filled with thick pus. We drained around 20 milliliters, irrigated the cavity thoroughly, and debrided some necrotic tissue." Mark blinked at the word. "Necrotic? Dead tissue?" he rasped. "Yes," Dr. Lang confirmed. "The infection had already killed some of the soft tissue in your nasal vestibule. We had to remove it to prevent further spread." Mark closed his eyes. Amanda visited that evening. She gasped softly when she saw him. The entire lower half of his face was bandaged. His nose was unrecognizable, massive, swollen, distorted by bruising and surgical dressing. "Oh, Mark," she whispered, kneeling beside the bed, her hand gently wrapping around his. "I was so scared." He couldn't answer. The pain made forming words feel impossible. She sat with him into the night, holding a cup of ice chips to his lips every so often. He couldn't eat, could barely drink. The throbbing in his face made sleep impossible. By morning, things got worse. The swelling increased, not from the infection but from the surgical trauma. The left side of his face was grotesquely puffy, and the bruising had started to spread upward, forming dark purple blotches beneath his eye. The drain collected a thick, blood-tinged fluid. Nurses emptied it and measured the output every few hours. Mark watched, numb, as the bulb filled and refilled, knowing each drop represented more of what his body was trying to flush out. Dr. Lang came again on post-op day 2. "You're stable," he said, "but you're going to need at least 5 more days here. 4 antibiotics will continue around the clock. We'll remove the packing and drain in a few days, depending on how your body responds." Mark nodded slightly, but deep down the fear was creeping in. What if his nose never looked the same again? What if people stared? What if clients whispered? What if he couldn't go back to work without seeing that look on their faces, that slight hesitation, that tiny flash of surprise, before they recovered? On the 3rd morning after surgery, Mark awoke to the soft clatter of stainless steel instruments on a tray. The nurse was prepping for packing removal. The moment he had both feared and anticipated had arrived. His nose felt enormous, like a massive stone embedded in his face. It throbbed endlessly, and every shift of his head sent lightning bolts of discomfort across his cheek and temple. Amanda was in the chair beside him again, bleary-eyed but smiling. She had barely left since the operation, and though Mark had said little, her presence was the only comfort that pierced the fog of pain. Dr. Lange entered the room mid-morning. "We're going to remove the packing and examine the surgical site," he said. "It's going to feel uncomfortable, but it'll be over quickly." Mark gripped the sides of the bed as the nurse began. She started with the right nostril, carefully pulling out gauze strip after gauze strip, like unraveling a magician's scarf from a hidden pocket. It made a sickening wet sound. Then the left side. This time the pain was brutal. Mark clenched his jaw as he felt the long, blood-stained gauze sliding out of what felt like the core of his skull. Every inch of it scraped against raw, inflamed tissue. His eyes watered uncontrollably, and then it was done. Dr. Lange leaned in with a headlamp and nasal scope, gently navigating the inside of Mark's nose. He was quiet as he examined the tissue. Finally, he stepped back and nodded. "There's still inflammation, but the infection is clearing. The drainage has decreased significantly. We'll remove the drain tube tomorrow if that continues." Mark let out a shaky breath, relief briefly washing over the pain, but the relief didn't last. That evening, the bandages came off. The nurse gently peeled away the surgical tape and gauze that had held his swollen face together since surgery. The air felt cool against his exposed skin. Mark sat up slowly, propped by pillows, and turned toward the small mirror that Amanda held in shaking hands. What he saw was worse than he'd feared. His nose was swollen beyond recognition. Both nostrils were visibly asymmetric. The left nostril had collapsed slightly inward, forming an unnatural curve. The tip of his nose, once straight, well-defined, now drooped subtly to the left, lacking support. His skin was still red and bruised, mottled with yellow and purple splotches. The area around his left cheek and under his eye was puffy and discolored. But it wasn't just the bruising, it was the shape. The structure of his face had changed, permanently. Mark stared at his reflection, frozen. A man he didn't recognize looked back at him. Amanda sat beside him, trying not to cry. "Mark," she whispered, reaching for his hand. "It's just swelling. It'll go down. We don't know yet what it'll really look like." But he knew. He could feel it in the bone, the way his nostril caved, the tug of scar tissue under his cheek, the hollowness where support used to be. Later, alone, he touched his face with trembling fingers. There was a shallow divot inside the left nostril, scar tissue where the surgeon had removed necrotic flesh, a slight ridge near the bridge of his nose where swelling met bone unevenly. He thought of the version of himself from just 4 days ago. The clean, symmetrical profile, the self-assured expression in the mirror, the confidence, and now this, not a monster. But not the same man either. When Dr. Lange returned that night to check on him, Mark asked the question he had been dreading. "Will it stay like this?" The surgeon hesitated for a moment. "Much of what you see now is swelling. That will improve over time. But some of the changes, particularly the asymmetry and tip droop, are likely permanent unless surgically corrected." Mark closed his eyes. "So I'll need cosmetic surgery." "Possibly, yes," Dr. Lange replied. "Once the tissues heal completely, which can take 6 to 12 months, we can reassess. But insurance typically won't cover cosmetic revision unless it's medically necessary." Mark nodded numbly. He already knew what that meant, thousands more. Out of pocket. When Amanda came back in, he didn't speak. She sat beside him, gently rubbing his shoulder as he stared blankly at the wall. And even though she said nothing but kindness, even though her love hadn't wavered, a new kind of distance settled inside him. A deep, echoing shame. He didn't want her to see him like this, didn't want anyone to. Mark sat on his couch, propped up by 3 pillows, a blanket over his legs, despite the warm spring breeze coming through the cracked window. It had been 5 days since his discharge from the hospital, and yet every hour dragged like a week. His recovery, while medically on track, felt like a slow collapse into a version of himself he barely recognized. His face was still swollen, but the swelling was shifting, settling downward, making the structural changes even more apparent. The left nostril remained partially collapsed, and the tip of his nose leaned off-center, giving his once symmetrical face a permanent tilt. The bruising had faded from deep purples and blues to sickly yellows and greenish blotches that made his skin look diseased. He avoided mirrors. He hadn't looked at his reflection since the morning after surgery. Amanda had removed the bathroom mirror and covered the one in the hallway with a towel. It was her idea, a gesture of kindness. But it also felt like giving in, like accepting that his face was no longer something to be seen, only hidden. He spent most days in silence, curled on the couch, headphones in but no music playing, watching the street outside with a hollow gaze. Amanda brought him soups, protein drinks, and crushed ice. He forced himself to eat when she was in the room, but when she left, the food often sat untouched. The painkillers dulled the physical discomfort but did nothing for the growing weight in his chest. The sense that something essential had been stolen from him, not just his appearance, something deeper. His phone buzzed occasionally, coworkers checking in, his manager asking when he'd be able to return. He left the messages unread. He couldn't imagine going back to work. How could he stand in front of clients when his face drew stares before he even opened his mouth? How could he speak with confidence, pitch deals, project authority, when he barely had the strength to look anyone in the eye? The thought of returning to the office filled him with a kind of nausea. He pictured their expressions, sympathy wrapped in surprise, a quick glance at his face before they politely looked away. That flicker of reaction before the mask of professionalism slid back into place. He couldn't bear it. Amanda was patient. She never pushed, never questioned why he stared into space for hours. But Mark could feel the tension under her tenderness. She wanted him to fight, to engage, to believe that this was temporary, but he didn't believe that. Not really. Each time he touched his face, he felt the hollowness, the unfamiliar pull of tissue where support used to be. And he remembered, too clearly, the searing pain of the infection, the slow spread of inflammation, the helplessness in the hospital as his face ballooned out of his control. The trauma lived in his body now, in his nerves, in the beat of his heart every time he looked at his phone and saw a photo of who he used to be. And underneath all that, there was the shame. Shame that it had happened because of something so small, so stupid. He'd pulled a nose hair. That was it. One moment in a bathroom, one act of grooming, and now, this. He remembered every detail of that morning. The vanity light, the angle of the tweezers, the quick, careless yank. He could still hear the sound, the faint snap as the hair tore free, the sting of fluid, the drop of blood. He had dismissed it. Thought it was nothing. Now it echoed in his mind like a curse. One afternoon, about 10 days post-op, Amanda invited her sister and brother-in-law over. Just for coffee, she said. Just some normalcy. Mark refused to come out of the bedroom. He heard their voices in the kitchen, the clink of mugs, the soft laughter. He wanted to join them. He wanted to feel normal again, but he couldn't. Instead, he sat in the dark, wrapped in a hoodie, the drain bulb still clipped to his sweatshirt like a grotesque accessory. The surgical wound inside his nose was healing, but he could feel the rawness with every breath. His throat was perpetually dry from mouth breathing. He couldn't sleep more than 2 or 3 hours a night. He didn't even know what day it was anymore. That evening, Amanda sat beside him quietly. She didn't bring up the visit, didn't mention that her sister had asked how he was doing. She just sat there, one hand on his knee, anchoring him. "I miss you," she said gently. Mark's throat tightened. The words caught somewhere, between guilt and grief. "I'm still here," he murmured, though he didn't believe it himself. Later that night, when Amanda finally went to sleep, Mark crept into the bathroom. He turned on the light, stared into the mirror she had uncovered days ago. What stared back was a stranger. His face was a patchwork of recovery, swollen flesh, healing scars, subtle distortion. But it wasn't the physical difference that gutted him. It was the absence of something. A light behind the eyes, a confidence that used to live in his posture, gone. He leaned in, fingertips grazing the depression inside his left nostril, the slight droop of his nasal tip, and for the first time since surgery, he let the tears come. Not from pain, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense of loss. He didn't cry loudly. There were no sobs, just silent tears tracing down his cheeks as he stood, gripping the edge of the sink like it was the only thing keeping him from slipping into something bottomless. He didn't want to die, but part of him had. 2 weeks after surgery, Mark returned to Dr. Lang's office for his follow-up appointment. Amanda drove him in silence, both of them avoiding the subject hanging in the air like a storm cloud. What they might hear. The waiting room felt colder than it had before, less clinical, more final. Mark kept his head down, hoodie drawn up despite the warm afternoon, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. He didn't want the receptionist to see his face. even though she already had. When his name was called, he followed Amanda into the exam room like a man walking to his own sentencing. Dr. Lange entered a few minutes later, holding a tablet. He smiled, though it was a careful, measured smile, one that belonged to a man who delivered difficult news many times. "Mark," he said warmly, "it's good to see you on your feet. How are you feeling?" Mark hesitated. "Physically, better." Dr. Lange nodded. "Let's take a look." The examination was gentle but thorough. He used a nasal endoscope to peer into both nostrils, his brow furrowed in concentration as he navigated the internal tissue. Mark winced several times, but he endured it. When Dr. Lange finally stepped back, he gave a small sigh, not of disappointment, but not of triumph either. "The surgical site is healing well, the infection is completely resolved, and the internal tissues are closing nicely," he said. "But," Mark braced, "there are structural changes we can't ignore. The cartilage loss in the left vestibule has compromised nostril shape and tip support. Your nasal septum has shifted slightly, and the soft tissue in the lower lateral cartilage region is healing with scar tension." Mark swallowed hard. "So, this is permanent?" Dr. Lange met his eyes. "The current appearance will likely stabilize further over the next few months, but the asymmetry and collapse on the left side won't correct themselves. There is also some internal scarring that might cause minor airflow restriction over time." Amanda reached for Mark's hand. Mark didn't move. "And surgery?" he asked quietly. "A reconstructive rhinoplasty would be required," Dr. Lange confirmed. "We'd likely need to graft cartilage, either from your septum, ear, or even rib depending on the extent of the correction. I'd recommend waiting at least 6 months, maybe a year, to let the tissue fully mature." "And insurance?" Dr. Lange hesitated again. "Because this falls under cosmetic revision, unless function is severely impaired, most providers won't cover it." Mark felt a chill spread through his body. He already knew the answer, but hearing it out loud made it real. He couldn't afford it. Not with the hospital bills already piled high, not with work on pause, not with the fear that he might never return to the job he once loved. Amanda drove them home in silence. Mark watched the trees blur by, his reflection in the passenger window warping with the motion of the car. He looked more like a sketch than a man, his features distorted, incomplete. That night Amanda made dinner, pasta and salad, his favorite. He ate 3 bites before setting the fork down. She sat across from him, her own plate untouched. "We need to talk," she said softly. Mark didn't reply. "I know this is hard," she continued. "I know you feel like everything's changed, but I'm still here. I love you, Mark. This doesn't change that." Mark stared at his plate, the sauce congealing. "I'm not the same," he said finally. "You know it. I know it. You're still you," she said quickly. "No, I'm really not." His voice cracked and he looked up for the first time, eyes shining. "Do you know what it's like to look in the mirror and not recognize your own face? To see something broken staring back? I don't even know who I am right now. I'm not a salesman anymore. I'm not confident. I'm not presentable. I'm not whole." Amanda reached for his hand again. He let her take it, but his grip was limp, unresponsive. "You are whole," she whispered. "Just hurting." Mark pulled his hand back slowly. "I need time," he said. "I don't know how to be around people right now, even you." Amanda looked like she'd been slapped. She nodded once, slowly, and stood up from the table. "I'll sleep in the guest room," she said, her voice tight. Mark didn't stop her. That night, he couldn't sleep. He wandered into the living room, sat on the couch in the dark, and stared at nothing. The silence wrapped around him like a blanket, comforting in its emptiness. At 3 a.m., he pulled out his laptop. He Googled nose reconstruction after infection, asymmetric nostril repair, cost of cartilage graft surgery. He ended up on a Reddit thread, facial trauma recovery support group. The stories were raw, people injured in accidents, attacks, surgeries gone wrong, photos, scars, swelling, stories of pain and recovery and loss and hope, and shame. That word came up over and over again. Shame. He saw himself in every post, not in the circumstances, but in the aftermath, in the aching silence after the hospital, in the withdrawal, in the mirror avoidance, in the way partners left, in the way confidence didn't return, even after the face healed. He bookmarked the page. Then he clicked on his own photo folder. The last selfie he'd taken, 2 days before the incident, was still there, smiling, suit on, confidence in every pixel. He stared at it for a long time. Then he closed the laptop, And for the first time since the surgery, he whispered something out loud in the dark. "I'm scared." No one heard him, but admitting it, to the air, to himself, was the first step. The first time Mark returned to the office, it was early on a Tuesday morning, nearly 2 months after the surgery. He arrived an hour before anyone else, parking far from the entrance and using the back elevator. His manager had suggested a soft return. Ease into it, no pressure, just check emails, say hi. Amanda had picked out his outfit the night before. A dark blue button-down with a charcoal blazer, meant to draw focus away from his face. He trimmed his beard carefully to balance out the asymmetry. He even styled his hair the same way he had before the infection, hoping it might trick him, trick others, into seeing the old Mark. But the moment he stepped into the elevator, a cold dread settled into his stomach. The mirrors. Even though he'd avoided his reflection at home, he couldn't escape it here. The elevator doors closed behind him, and he was surrounded. 3 walls of mirrored glass showing every angle of his face. The tilt of his nose, the drooping tip, the subtle distortion where symmetry had once lived. He looked like someone else, a worse version, a reminder of failure. The doors opened on the 5th floor, and Mark stepped out quickly, keeping his head low. The fluorescent lighting in the office hallway didn't help. Everything looked sharper, colder, more exposed. He reached his desk. It was just as he had left it, organized, impersonal. His coffee mug still sat in the corner, half filled with pens. A motivational quote on the side read, "Confidence is silent. Insecurities are loud." The irony made him want to throw it. He logged into his computer, hands trembling slightly. Dozens of unread emails. Meetings he'd missed. Opportunities gone. After 30 minutes of mindless scrolling, he saw his reflection again in the black screen of his second monitor, just faintly enough to catch the shape of his face. That was all it took. He stood up and walked straight to the restroom. Inside, he locked himself in the farthest stall, and he sat there for nearly 20 minutes, elbows on his knees, head in his hands, heart pounding. He hadn't seen anyone yet. No coworkers, no clients. But the anxiety was like static buzzing under his skin. When he finally returned to his desk, his manager, Christine, was waiting. She offered a warm smile. "Hey, stranger," she said softly. "It's good to see you." Mark forced a smile, trying to ease back in. Christine sat on the edge of the next desk. "No pressure, really. We're just glad you're okay. Everyone's been worried." He nodded, grateful, but couldn't meet her eyes for long. "You know, whenever you're ready for a client call again, let me know. No rush. But we have that Midwest account still waiting on a proposal. You had a great rapport with their lead rep. I think you could really—" "I'll let you know," Mark interrupted. Christine nodded slowly. "Of course, just don't disappear, okay?" But that was exactly what Mark wanted. He lasted 2 more days. By the 3rd, during a casual team huddle in the conference room, someone made a joke, a harmless one. Something about getting punched in the face by a sinus infection. The whole room laughed. Even Christine, they hadn't meant him. It wasn't even directed at him. But Mark froze, his vision tunneled, his palms went cold. And when someone asked him a question about a sales forecast, he couldn't answer. The numbers blurred, his voice caught. The meeting moved on without him. That afternoon he packed up early and emailed HR, requested a medical leave extension, citing post-surgical adjustment issues. He never went back. At home, Amanda tried to hold it together. She gave him space, but space eventually turned into distance. She cooked, cleaned, reminded him to take his medications. But the warmth had thinned into routine. Sometimes, she'd sit beside him on the couch and touch his hand, just to connect. But Mark barely responded. He rarely initiated conversation. He no longer joked or teased or flirted. She missed him. Even though he was right there one night, she said, "I don't care about your face, Mark. I care that you're disappearing." Mark stared at the ceiling. "Maybe that's easier for both of us." "That's not fair," she snapped. "You don't get to decide for me what I can live with. You're not a burden. You're not broken. I feel broken, but you're not," she said, nearly pleading. "You're still you." "No," he whispered. "I used to walk into a room and feel like I owned it. Now I walk into a room and pray no one looks at me." Amanda wiped away tears. "Then let me carry you until you remember who you are." Mark looked at her for a long moment, and then he turned away. The next morning she left for work without saying goodbye. That afternoon, Mark stood in front of the mirror for the first time in weeks. Not the bathroom mirror, a full-length one in the hallway. He studied himself, not just his nose, his whole body, the way his shoulders slouched now, the hollowness under his eyes, the way his skin had lost its glow. He looked sick, not just in the face, in the soul. Later that week, Amanda came home to find him gone. Not gone in the dramatic sense, he hadn't left. But emotionally, spiritually, he was unreachable. He barely spoke, barely ate. He spent most of his time on online forums, reading about facial trauma, reconstructive surgery, identity loss. He started sleeping on the couch, told Amanda it was because he couldn't breathe well lying flat. But they both knew it wasn't the real reason. They stopped kissing, stopped touching. The apartment felt like a museum of their former life, photos from happier times still on the walls, laughter trapped in the fibers of the carpet. But the love was quiet now. Starved of sunlight, Mark spent long nights researching plastic surgery options. He created a private folder titled Project Me. Inside were screenshots of his old face, notes from consultations he couldn't afford, articles about psychological recovery after disfigurement. He started making lists, pros and cons, best-case scenarios, worst-case outcomes. He calculated costs, timelines, risks. He looked up clinical trials, hoping for free surgery through experimental programs. It became his obsession. Amanda noticed. One night she said, "You've turned yourself into a project. But you're a person, Mark. My person." He didn't answer. She added, "Do you even see me anymore?" "I see your disappointment," he said flatly. Amanda stepped back like he'd slapped her. "I'm done walking on eggshells," she said after a long silence. "I love you, but I can't keep loving someone who won't let me in." She packed a bag and left for her sister's that night. Mark didn't stop her. He just sat on the couch, staring at the folder on his laptop. Project Me had become more than a plan. It had become a replacement for his life. The therapist's office was quiet, painted in muted greens and browns, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a faint smell of eucalyptus. It was Amanda who had found Dr. Rachel Myers, a trauma-informed psychotherapist specializing in body image disorders and post-surgical adjustment. Mark had resisted for weeks, but after Amanda left, after the apartment became too quiet, after the anxiety started to creep into his chest like an old, unwelcome friend, he finally made the call. He didn't say much during the first 2 sessions, mostly nodded, offered short answers, avoided eye contact. Dr. Myers was patient, unbothered by the silence. She never forced him into anything. She just left space for the truth to arrive on its own. By the 3rd session, Mark finally spoke. "I don't know who I am anymore, Doctor." Myers looked at him, not with pity, but with quiet recognition. "When did you last feel like yourself?" Mark hesitated. Before all this, he gestured vaguely toward his face. Before the surgery, before the infection. Dr. Myers tilted her head. "Are you sure it started there?" That question lingered with him all week. At the next session, she asked about his childhood, about middle school, about the first time he remembered feeling less than. He resisted at first. Then one session, without knowing why, the memory broke loose. He was 14, standing in the boys' bathroom at Lincoln High, the air thick with the smell of cologne and teenage sweat. 2 older boys were standing near the sink, laughing at something on a phone. Mark was washing his hands when he heard one of them snicker and say, "Dude, look at his nose hair. Looks like a damn spider's living in there." The laughter was cruel, not loud, but sharp, razor precise. Mark had rushed home that day, heart pounding, face burning, and gone straight to his dad's old grooming kit. He'd never used tweezers before. He remembered standing in the mirror, pulling at his skin, trying to figure out how to fix himself. That was the day he first plucked a nose hair. The day he decided some parts of him weren't acceptable. "I started grooming out of shame," he told Dr. Myers. She nodded. "That's a powerful emotion to tie to your own body." Mark looked away, his voice low. "It's not just about the infection, it's that I thought I'd finally built something, confidence, a career, a relationship, but all it took was one weak spot, and it came apart." Dr. Myers leaned in slightly. Maybe it didn't fall apart. Maybe it revealed what was never healed. "That session," Mark cried, not silently, not with controlled tears like before, but openly, deeply, like something inside him had finally snapped, then softened. He stayed in therapy. Every week he went back. And little by little, the weight inside his chest began to lift, not disappear, but become more bearable. Dr. Myers helped him name things he'd never dared say aloud. body dysmorphia, medical PTSD, grief not just for his appearance, but for the younger self he'd abandoned all those years ago in that bathroom. And one night, sitting alone in the dark, lit only by the glow of his laptop, Mark began to write. It started with a simple title, "I almost died from plucking a nose hair," but what followed wasn't just about the infection. It was about shame, about identity, about how fragile confidence can be when it's built on how you think the world sees you. He wrote for 3 hours. Every detail, every mistake, every humiliation, the ER, the swelling, the surgery, the aftermath, the mirror. He included photos, one before the infection, one during the worst swelling, and one now. He ended the post like this: "If you think it can't happen to you, it can. If you think you're strong enough to hide your insecurities forever, you're not. I plucked one nose hair, and it nearly destroyed me. Not just physically, but mentally. But I'm still here, still healing, still learning how to live in this new version of myself." He posted it anonymously on Reddit, r/askdocs. He expected a few comments, maybe some trolls BBR. By morning the post had 2,000 upvotes. Y afternoon 20,000 dabur in 2 days. Over 1 million people had read it. Here were doctors commenting, emergency physicians, ENTs, infectious disease specialists. Many said they'd treated similar cases, though rarely this severe. Some even asked if they could use his post in medical training sessions. Theirs were more personal. Hundreds of people shared their own horror stories, facial infections, grooming injuries, shame spirals. One man said, "This exact thing happened to my brother. We thought he was being dramatic. He was in the ICU within 48 hours." Woman wrote, "I'm a nurse. We always warn patients about the danger triangle of the face. Nobody listens. Thank you for showing why it matters." But most comments were just human, supportive, gentle. "You're brave for posting this. You're still handsome. This story made me cry. Thank you." Mark sat there reading every comment, every upvote, feeling something shift inside him. Not healed, not whole, but less alone. By the end of the week, his story had gone viral, shared on Facebook, Twitter, even covered in a BuzzFeed health article titled, "The Man Who Nearly Died from a Nose Hair and Lived to Warn Us All." The post gave him back something he hadn't realized he'd lost: purpose. For the first time since the surgery, he felt like his pain had value. That maybe, just maybe, someone out there would pause before reaching for the tweezers, or pause before mocking a teenager in a bathroom, or look in the mirror with a little more kindness. One afternoon, Dr. Myers asked, "How do you feel about your story being out there now?" Mark thought for a long moment. "I used to feel like my face betrayed me," he said. "Now, I think it tells the truth." Dr. Myers smiled. "That's a powerful shift." Mark nodded. "I'm tired of hiding. I want people to know what happened, not to scare them, but to remind them that we all carry something invisible. Mine just happened to show up on my face." Dr. Amanda Reeves's office smelled like citrus and cedar. It was sleek, softly lit, professional in a way that didn't feel cold. Mark sat across from her, his hands loosely clasped in his lap, his throat dry with a mixture of hope and fear. She studied his face with the clinical eye of a reconstructive surgeon and the empathy of someone who had clearly heard stories like his before. "Based on your scans and the external structure," she said, tapping her tablet, "we're looking at a cost around $10,000 to $12,000, possibly more if cartilage grafting becomes necessary." Mark didn't flinch. He had expected this. Still, hearing the number aloud made something tighten in his chest. "Doctor," Reeves continued, "we can restore most of the symmetry. I can't give you the exact nose you had before, but I can get you very close. Probably 80 to 85% in terms of structure and appearance." He nodded slowly. "But insurance?" She gave a sympathetic half smile. "Because it's no longer a functional issue, and more cosmetic at this stage, it won't be covered. I'm sorry." Mark left the office that day not discouraged, but resolved. There was a time, not so long ago, when he would have applied for a loan without thinking twice, paid whatever it took just to erase the damage. But not anymore. He didn't want to go into debt over his face. He didn't want to rush this next part of his journey. So he made a decision. He would wait 1 year, 12 months to save every possible dollar. No dining out, no splurges. He canceled his streaming services, took freelance marketing gigs on weekends, and lived as simply as he could. He kept his goal written on a note card taped to his fridge. "This is for healing, not vanity." It wasn't just about the money. It was about the time. He needed this space to grow into the person he was becoming, the one who no longer needed perfection to feel worthy. In that year, Mark changed. He spoke at 2 medical conferences, standing on stage with a subtle bend in his nose and a story that held an entire room silent. He joined a support group for people living with facial differences due to trauma or surgery. He stayed in therapy. He started to smile again, real smiles, not the half-forced ones he had used to get through the early months. He even started dating again, slowly, cautiously. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, days when he looked in the mirror and felt the weight of everything he had lost. But more often now, he felt grateful. By the time the day of surgery arrived, Mark had saved just over $11,300, enough to pay in full. He lay in the hospital bed, listening to the soft beep of machines, the rustle of blue scrubs, the low hum of morning preparations. Dr. Reeves came in, marking light lines across his nose with a surgical pen, explaining the steps one last time. "I'll be using cartilage from your ear to rebuild the inner structure," she said. "We'll reshape the bridge, correct the tip droop, and do some subtle work around the nostrils for symmetry." Mark wasn't nervous. He was ready. The anesthesia was cold going in. He counted to 6. Then everything went black. When he woke up, the world was gauze and pressure, and the groggy disorientation of coming out of surgery. His nose was bandaged, his upper lip swollen, his voice hoarse from the intubation. But there was no panic, just calm. Dr. Reeves visited him later that afternoon. "Surgery went very well," she said. "No complications. You'll need to keep the splint on for about 10 days, but the early signs are very encouraging." The recovery wasn't easy. There was pain, tightness, occasional bleeding. He slept upright for almost 2 weeks, kept ice on his face constantly, and followed every post-op instruction like gospel. The bruising came and went in deep purples and greens. The swelling lingered for nearly a month, but slowly, it faded. And then, 10 days later, he returned to Dr. Reeves for the splint removal. He sat in the chair as she carefully peeled away the tape, the dressing, the final layer of protection that had kept his new nose hidden. He didn't speak, didn't breathe, and then, he saw it, not perfect, but familiar. The curve of the bridge was back. The tip no longer drooped. The nostrils were nearly symmetrical. His face, finally, looked like his own again. Not the exact version from before, but something close enough that he no longer felt like a stranger behind his skin. Dr. Reeves handed him a mirror. Mark looked at himself for a long time. What he saw was not a patient, not a victim, but a man who had survived. For the first time in nearly 2 years, he felt peace. He left the clinic into the late afternoon sun, the city warm and golden around him. People passed by without a second glance. No stares, no subtle flinches, just another face in the crowd. And for once, that was exactly what he wanted. Back at home, he stood in front of his bathroom mirror, no longer covered, and looked at his reflection again. The scar on his inner nostril was still there, faint but permanent, a reminder, not of damage, but of resilience. He smiled, not because he looked good, but because he felt whole. Amanda had texted him earlier that day, wishing him luck, saying she was proud of him. They hadn't reconciled romantically, but they spoke often now, 2 people forever connected by what they had weathered, together. Mark messaged her back simply, "It's done. I feel human again." That night he opened his Reddit account and updated his original post with a new photo and a final message. "It's been 18 months since the day I plucked that hair. I had the reconstruction surgery last week. It's not perfect, and it never will be. But I finally look in the mirror, and don't see a mistake. I see someone who made it through." The comments poured in. "You look amazing. You're an inspiration. Thank you for showing us what real healing looks like." Mark turned off his phone, lay back on the couch and closed his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like hiding. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel broken. He felt like a man who had been torn apart and stitched back together, not perfectly, but with purpose. And that was enough. It was a quiet morning, the kind of morning where the world felt slower, gentler. Sunlight spilled through the half-open blinds in soft golden stripes, dust dancing in the air like forgotten memories. The bathroom was still fogged slightly from the shower, the mirror clearing just enough for Mark to see his own reflection. He looked at the man staring back. His face, still subtly altered, was no longer something to fear. The asymmetry in his nostrils, The barely visible scar inside his left one, it was all still there. But it didn't define him anymore. It didn't consume him. Mark leaned forward, squinting slightly, and then, from the drawer beneath the sink, he pulled out a small object wrapped in tissue, the old silver tweezers, the very same pair from that morning 2 years ago, the ones that had started it all. He held them between his fingers. They were light, innocent-looking. He studied them for a long time. For a moment, his fingers tensed, an echo of the habit. The reflex burned deep into his brain. He could still remember the feeling of that hair, the quick pull, the sting, the careless confidence, and then, everything after: pain, swelling, fear, disfigurement, shame, loneliness, but also growth, forgiveness, understanding, and healing. Mark exhaled slowly, as if letting go of something invisible, but heavy. Then, without ceremony, he turned, walked to the small trash bin next to the sink, and dropped the tweezers in. They landed with a soft clink against an empty plastic bottle. Mark stared at them for a second longer, then nodded. A quiet decision, a closing of a chapter, a symbol of everything he was no longer carrying. Later that week, Mark stood on stage at a university medical symposium, under the bright lights of an auditorium filled with students, doctors, and educators. Behind him was a large projected photo, a before and after of his face, with the caption, "It started with a single plucked hair." He looked out over the sea of attentive faces. "You're probably wondering how a pharmaceutical consultant ended up giving a talk at a medical school," he said with a half smile. The crowd chuckled. "The answer is, because no one expects a nose hair to change your life." Laughter again, but quieter, thoughtful. He told them everything, not just the medical crisis, but the psychology, the trauma, the shame, the pressure to be polished, the fear of not being enough, the need to control how others saw him, all distilled into a single stupid, impulsive decision, and how life doesn't always give you second chances, but it gave him one. "I almost died because of a moment of vanity," he said, "but I survived because I finally learned how to be human. I used to think the worst thing that could happen was losing part of my face. I was wrong. The worst thing would have been never looking deeper into why it happened, and staying broken." There was silence in the room, not the awkward kind, the reverent kind. That evening, Mark walked through a small park near his apartment. Children played. A street musician strummed a guitar. A breeze moved through the trees. He sat on a bench and watched the world go by, a soft, content expression on his face. His phone buzzed. A notification from Reddit. "Your story is now being used in medical ethics courses across 12 universities." He smiled. He hadn't written the post for fame. He had written it to release the weight, to warn others, to make peace with himself. That it had become something more, something that could teach, could heal others, felt like a quiet miracle. He opened the comments section and scrolled past hundreds of messages. "Your story changed how I see myself. I used to feel so ashamed about my face. Not anymore. You made me cry in the best way. Thank you for surviving." Mark closed the app and leaned back on the bench. Above him, the clouds were turning pink. The next morning, he stood once more in front of the mirror. Not inspecting, not judging, just looking, seeing. He touched his nose gently, not in fear, not in mourning, but in gratitude, he whispered to himself. Not for anyone else to hear. "I lost my nose, to finally find myself," and in that moment he smiled, not because he was perfect, but because he was whole. Be careful with small decisions. They can change everything. Forgive yourself for old wounds, and never let someone else's standard of beauty cost you your sense of self.